I have been giving you what might be called fundamental pre-educational instruction about various extremely simple things that were left out of our ordinary education. I described last night the thing about space that's ordinarily left out. I also described in the course of the discussion the game about the in-group and the out-group, the nice people and the nasty people, which is also left out of ordinary education. And I have furthermore described the game of black and white. You know, the one where we pretend that black and white don't go together and one of them might win. And I've also described to you the Zen game, which is taking a person's false premises to their logical conclusion and seeing what happens. So the person who is born into the prejudice that one should get somehow one up on this universe suddenly finds himself confronted with an insoluble problem. Only he doesn't know that his insoluble problem is based on asking or posing the problem in a meaningless and false way. And so it takes a certain kind of training for this to be found out. So what we're really doing, although it's being done under the cover of studies of the Orient and of Japanese culture and so on, what we're really doing is going down through these cultural, historical, religious, artistic manifestations to the fundamental game which life is playing. And if you get the hang of these, the comprehension of various culture forms becomes ever so much easier. You see, whatever you study, to become a master of the subject, you need to realize what are the fundamental principles. And very few teachers of anything ever give them to you, because quite often they don't know them. I remember very well, the only time I've been a very serious examiner of candidates for office was when I was an examining chaplain to the Bishop of Chicago and had to examine young men wanting to be ordained to the ministry. And I used to have many questions through which I could find out whether or not they had the least comprehension of the principles of theology. And it was only very rarely that any of them did, because they didn't teach the principles in theological school. They taught all the details, and so you memorized the details, and you had to know that, see, because in an examination they'd ask you about the details. But when an examiner asked you to fit the details together into some sort of sensible pattern, everybody was totally at a loss. So, in Christian theology, there are various doctrines. We have things like the virgin birth, the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin. We have the doctrine of the ascension of Jesus into heaven, the idea that his risen physical body suddenly disappeared into heaven. And we have, for example, in Christianity, the celebration of the Mass, the sacrament of Holy Communion. And I used to ask candidates for the ministry, what was the relationship between these three doctrines, or these three things, the virgin birth, the ascension, and the Holy Communion? And they were at one total and utter loss. They would say that the Holy Communion service mentions the other two events in the course of saying the creed. But the idea that these things had any organic relation to each other, as they in fact do, was utterly left out of their instruction. And so it's in just the same way that all these fundamental games are left out of our education, almost advisedly. because they're things that you really have to find out for yourself. And nobody ought to teach them to you. But I want to speak this evening about another aspect of this fundamental game. And we play all sorts of games with each other. One very significant game that we play is a game called My Game's More Interesting Than Yours. And this is a very, very important game for developing an elaborate culture. And you remember when I was talking to you about the four great Japanese masters of the 17th century, Hakuin and Bankei as Zen teachers, Basho, poet, Sengai, who was also a Zen teacher, but is chiefly remembered as a painter. And how Basho went back to the naive in poetry, and Sengai was the greatest master of what's called Zenga. Za, in the sense of painting. It is Zenga, that is Zen-style painting. It is Haiga, which is the kind of painting that goes with haiku writing. Haiku, hai, means playful. Playful painting, or so haiku is, ku means a phrase. So haiku is playful phrase. Well, anyway, the point was that after the extreme refinement of Chinese poetry, and in its wake, Japanese poetry, where you had to be terribly in the know to understand it at all because the game had become so complicated. There was a genius like Basho who upstaged everybody, you see, by his utterly disarming simplicity. And the history of cultural development, the history of art, the history of architecture, of poetry, of music, is always doing this. It proceeds like this. You see, we go back to our fundamental rhythm, which is sound and silence, or on and off. And so you've just got and the life force says, that's not very interesting. Oh, that's kind of boring. See, and so it goes, until you get to. You know, that's only one bar. And people got to keep track of it, see? And my, when you get to Hindu music, with those tremendous complex phrases, and they know how to count all that, see? They're not just fooling around. They've got it all figured out. Only they're counting in such a complicated way that you have to be very, very good indeed at counting to follow. So in exactly the same way with poetry, dancing, steps, gestures, all these rhythms, we work them out to marvelous complexity because what essentially happens is this. Let's take a group of people who are playing drums. Somebody starts out, you see, who sets a basic kind of simple rhythm. Then the next fellow who joins in goes into the spaces which that fellow is leaving, so that he does a rhythm consistent with his, though, that fills in his spaces. Then a third person joins in, and he may fill in spaces that are still left, or give, by coincidence with beats in their rhythm, extra emphasis to certain beats so that they sound louder or softer as the case may be. And so they start vying with each other. In this case, they have to vie with each other in a cooperative way, because whenever you get an orchestra going, you can't have one person playing better than all the rest, sort of thing, or louder. Just as in rowing, you can't say, well, the whole team rowed beautifully, and especially the man in the stroke position who rowed faster than everybody else. You see, but they manage, you see, within the general rule that in this kind of game we're going to cooperate. Because if we don't, we can't have the game. But within those limits, we are going to compete to see who can be more interesting or create a more interesting pattern, keeping all the time in accord with the basis, and vie with each other as to who can be more skillful. So also in Indian music, very often you have a thing called the drone. There is one instrument which is playing the tonal note, which is, as it were, the basis of the chord. And all other notes which are being played by various other instruments relate to this fundamental tone. And so in the symbolism of Hindu music, they say the fundamental tone refers to the Brahman, the one. And all the different melodies and harmonies related to that tone are the universe of the many manifested in the one. The tone always goes through, we call it the drone. But it's extremely fascinating to listen just to the drone and see how much there is to playing one note. So, but in relation to the drone, they build up the most unbelievably complex harmony, as in relation to a basic rhythm. They build up a whole pattern of rhythm. But you see what's going to happen as this pattern gets progressively complex. It's going to fill in all the space, so that gradually you won't be able to hear it at all. As the musicians and the drummers vie with each other in making it ever so much more subtle and complex, they are going to approach a point where you cease to be able to hear it. It's as if you were writing on a piece of paper and somebody did the basic shape, and then other people filled in and mixed up and went on and on and on, creating ever more subtle arabesques and designs, until finally there wasn't any white background left and the whole sheet was a black blob. But that's exactly what happens in the development of an art form or a cultural system. It happens with the development of a religion. Because a religion, as it evolves, becomes ever and ever more subtle. There is more theology. There are more refinements of doctrine, refinements of ritual. And so it goes also in manners. How mannered can you be, you see? You can become such a refined aristocrat that, as I said about quoting Ruth Benedict's experience with a Japanese girl who went to one of the very, very refined New England ladies' colleges and found that she was equipped with a culture that nobody could even begin to understand. And her equipment was useless in that environment. So in the development of a culture, you get more and more genteel until you've out-genteeled everybody. Also in a religion, you can get more and more profound, or even more and more saintly, till you've out-sainted everybody. And then nobody can understand you, nobody can follow you. So you're left are all in a little world of your own, playing this game. And then somebody comes into the scene to one-up everybody and says, now look, let's take, for example, cooking, the subject on which I have extremely authoritative prejudices. You can get so way out in refined sauces, and you can get into such incredible arguments about French wines and their comparable merits. And you can become a wine snob to the nth degree. Until finally somebody suggests an entirely new approach, which is a very, very far out group of gourmets who are really hung up on water. You know, water is just the most beautiful substance. And all these people have so ruined their palates with these excessively refined foods, they can't taste water anymore. And so the real in school are the people who can taste water. See? I say water is good. I remember I had an uncle who was terribly sick for a while, just horribly sick. And when he got, after his operations and so on, he was convalescing and they gave him a drink of water. He said, oh, for the first time in my life, I realized what a good thing water is. So, it's like when you have had every kind of pleasure and you've been able to own everything you ever wanted and to go everywhere you ever wanted and so on, you have to come back from all that to the realization of how marvelous it is just to exist. But then the whole thing begins over again, because the people who, all those gourmets who started the pure water school begin to become sensitive about waters from different wells, different localities. And then they bring their friends to a water drinking ceremony. Somebody says, listen, tonight I have a special kind of water from a very, very special well. And there's really nothing like it. Now all those guests are put in a very strange position, because they've got to decide then and there whether to say to him, listen man, you're just imagining things. This water is all right, it's just like any other water, but that would be awfully discourteous to those. And if they want to keep the game going, they've got to say, why yes, there is something that is curiously different about this. Yeah, I believe, yeah, there's a subtle, very small point, but by Jove, we all see it, you know, and therefore we're way in. Now, this really goes back to the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes. And this is going on all the time in our various arts and cultures, and it's peculiarly evident today in a period when social change is so fast and so bewildering that nobody really knows what's what. Let's take in the West, the art world. Well now, if you study the history of Western art, you will find that it is an extraordinarily instructive thing. You will be led up to the early 20th century, say in painting, in a very, very clear logical way. But as you watch, that as this historical process goes on, the painters become more and more aware of the fact of a historical progression in art. And they are more and more asking, what is the new thing going to be? Now you know, for example, that when Beethoven's symphonies were first played, I'm thinking particularly of the Third Symphony, the reviews in the Vienna newspapers were absolutely terrible. His work is referred to as cacophony, as an absolute insult to the whole art of music, as being dreadful. And so, people living now who are writing music, which to many ears is dreadful, are saying, but they said this about Beethoven, what you're saying about my work. And it's very fascinating to hear read one of the criticisms, contemporary criticisms of Beethoven's symphony, without the reader first telling you what the context is, where he's taking this from. And you imagine it's some critic talking about some contemporary composer. And then he says, well, that was Baron von so-and-so talking about Beethoven. Well, you see, the artist has, in our era, become aware of the history of art to a degree that was not at all the case in the past. There were no art historians when Bach was alive. And they had no idea then that there was a sort of progress in the development of a culture form. They were trying to do certain things which they found important to do. They were playing musical games or painting games and finding out things that might indeed be new ways of treating it. But they didn't have the idea that they ought to be finding more and more and more and more new things. In many cases, they were simply trying to penetrate more and more deeply the conceptions of art that they already had. But there wasn't this feeling of a historical progress. And so, as this feeling has come upon us today, not only in the history, say, of Western art alone, or the history of Western philosophy, but also the mingling of cultures brought about by modern transportation, in which the Western artists suddenly become aware of enormous artistic traditions from the very ends of the earth, who suddenly can't make up our minds and can find no standard as to what is really good. And therefore, every kind of mountebank can challenge our situation and say, now this is the newest thing which nobody has done before, which never was, that challenges you completely, and he may simply take a whole lot of wire and melt it so that it vaguely flows together, and then bang it about for a while, and then upend it and stick it on an extremely tasteful polished wood pedestal, and call it Opus 35 and a half. Now, what are you to do about this? It may be that this work has the same sort of interest that damp stains on a ceiling sometimes have, because they become a Rorschach slot into which we can project many interesting things. So in the same way, this particular mess of mangled wire may have that sort of merit. But lean on it a little, or you'll miss something. So, but everybody is vaguely wondering inside, you know, ought I to speak out on this? and declare myself, therefore, as some sort of Philistine. I don't like this thing. I don't want a bunch of mangled wire in my house and pay $10,000 for it. But then if I do that, somebody very, very adept is going to come along and say, well, I'm very sorry, but I understand your prejudices in that you say this sort of thing about this work of art, but there really are things to it which have some merit. And if you understood the history of art a little better, you would see, in fact, that this person has something to say. Well, then you feel absolutely awful that you didn't see it and that you'd somehow missed out on it. But the fact of the matter is, you see, that all kinds of people are playing this game, and quite sincerely, in the sense that some of them don't know it's a game, because they have, in the course of coming across some extremely bizarre creation, found that it indeed had some merit that perhaps the artist never knew anything about. You know, just in the same way as the artist with the patches of damp on the ceiling, that was presumably an act of God, had no intention to make a representation of what you saw in. So in the same way, the person who throws a lot of mangled wire together may occasionally produce something that, to a very perceptive person, will be provocative. Not through any merit in the work of art, but through the beauty which was in the eye of the beholder. And so that person, in all sincerity, says, well, I did see this remarkable thing here, and, well, I do think there is something very special about this. I must tell you a story to illustrate this. We had an experiment, a few friends of ours, who were working on this chemical LSD. And the experiment consisted in, stop me if you've heard this one, but there were a group of people who were very, very knowledgeable in the field of modern art, really knowledgeable. The hostess of the group ran one of the most important galleries in New York. There was present an eminent sculptor who is no mangled wire man, and one or two other people who really understood, I would say, the whole history of modern art from the Baroque on. And we were all sitting round one painting, which was the first cubist painting ever done by Villon. I think it was painted in about 1905. It was shown at the Armory show in New York. And it has great ovoid forms in it, with great detail and apparent overlapping of planes. And we sat around this painting and looked at it. And we were in a state of very, very heightened consciousness. But the whole session was a discussion about this painting. And gradually all of us developed an idea that is very fantastic. The idea was that a good artist living at the beginning of the 20th century, who had really been to school, would be someone who would be competent in any technique that had been evolved in the course of Western painting. In other words, he could perfectly well imitate Giotto if he wanted to. He could imitate Michelangelo, Raphael, Rubens. He could imitate the Dutch masters, the Flemings. He could imitate Hieronymus Bosch. He could finally go on and imitate Watteau and Cézanne, Matisse. And what he did in this painting was that he painted 5 paintings on top of each other, each one in the style of one of the great Western masters. He overlapped them in such a way that they finally amalgamated together in a new style which hadn't yet been seen, which was Cubism. And we sat there and we traced out, pointing at the painting and going up and discussing with the other people the various figures in it, done in the styles of the different painters, until this extraordinary amalgamated technical tour de force emerged. And we had a marvelous evening doing this. But then when we all, after many, many days went by, thought about it, we realized that, of course, what we'd been doing was projecting ourselves and our imaginations into this painting, that this might have nothing whatever to do with what Villon had intended. But we were giving him the highest credit as a great artist for doing this astonishing achievement. So you see, to what an extent the beholder enters into a work of art, how he contributes things that the artist may never have seen. And if this happens in the world of art, it happens to exactly the same degree in, say, the world of religion. How, for century after century, intelligent people who have become more and more sophisticated have read more and more meaning into the Bible, and have made this originally rather crude piece of Bronze Age literature into a very, very sophisticated document. So that somebody can say to you, you mean you don't dig the Bible? Well, now what kind of person is likely to say this to? And if some kind of fundamentalist comes along, who believes that everything in the Bible is literally true, you can dismiss him rather easily. Thank you very much. But when some great subtle theologian, say Paul Tillich, or say, representing a very different point of view, a Catholic theologian like Jacques Maritain, comes along and says, now, wait a minute. You can't dismiss this as a lot of Bronze Age literature. Just consider it. Let's really go into it. But as soon as that starts, what is happening is that the highly evolved and sophisticated mind of a modern biblical scholar or theologian is weaving his own marvelous interpretation back into the text. What you're getting is not Isaiah or Jesus Christ. You're getting Tillich or Maritain, with all the historical experience and wisdom that they have through knowing the course and the history of Western scholarship and theology. They feed it all back. They feed the future back into the past and recreate the past with their own imagination. And which is fine. That's creation, after all, isn't it? That's taking the scaffolding, or rather it's taking the steel beams or the bones and it's putting flesh on. It is variations on a theme. Beautiful. But please, don't be bewildered by this kind of thing. Don't be befuddled and led to undervalue your own honest feelings about religion, about art, about anything. Because anybody who involves you in this game is really, well, I mean, I'm saying he may be doing this unconsciously. He may not be actually deliberately playing games with you. But let's put it in this way. You begin to believe about someone that the way they're living is sick. This may or may not be true, but let's suppose it isn't. But nevertheless, because you think that person is behaving in a sick way, you meet them one morning and say, hi, say, are you feeling all right? Why, yes. What makes you ask? I just wonder. Then the next time we meet, how are you doing? You better today? Better? What do you mean better? I was fine. Oh, I see. Well, yeah, maybe. I just thought the other day you weren't quite up to scratch. You said something about feeling a little off. And so later on, say it comes up, well, I suppose you are feeling all right. I mean, there are so many things about us that we're unconscious of. Difficulty, you know, certain diseases like cancer aren't detected in their early stages because we're not aware of them. And of course, they're all psychological disorders. I mean, it's of the essence of them that they're unconscious and that you don't know what it is. And you should be in a group of Jungians and be a naive person who ventures to tell a dream. And you had a dream about something, you know, that was rather impressive, and they shake their heads and say, with a dream like that, you better be careful. You need to see an analyst in a hurry. Well, I mean, this is that bad. So, when you get to among any group of devotees, I don't care what kind of devotee they are, it doesn't make any difference. But they give the outsider the subtle feeling that, yes, you're all right. But, I mean, there is this thing we have that is very, very important. And if you don't see it the way we do, somehow you're not quite human. So you wonder, you see, this immediately throws you into a self-questioning. It implants a doubt in your mind. And if, you know, you are really a genuine person, you have no problem with it. Because you don't react by saying, oh my, isn't that impressive? Maybe I better find out what all this is. You don't do that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you don't react in a hostile way and say, oh, shut up, leave me alone, you're just playing games. I mean, there might be something interesting to find out here. And if so, I mean, you're bright and perky-eared and bushy-tailed. And is there something here they've got? Well, maybe there is. But if you see that really what it is that it is essential to these people to be the profoundest people there are. And they've got to have you convinced of this in order to carry the conviction in themselves. Then they're playing games with you. So the problem is to create the person who, by a fundamental honesty within himself, a fundamental sincerity, he's not going to be pushed around in these games. And so this is the test. Which is set by a great teacher in any sphere, whether it's religion or whether it's painting or whatever. Do you, as a student, feel the need to justify yourself? Lao Tzu said in a marvelous line, those who justify themselves do not convince. Now, there is, as I said, on the one hand, the student who is overawed and always a prey, therefore, to any charlatan who comes along with a big line. And so the teacher will often play the role of charlatan. Watch out for this. This was the great point of Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff went out of his way to play at being a charlatan. He did the most elaborate acts of charlatanry that one ever heard of. You all know who Gurdjieff was? Well, Gurdjieff was a remarkable Russian, a countryman of Stalin from Georgia. Not Georgia, but the Georgia in the Caucasus. And he established a school for the harmonious development of man in Paris. And it flourished from the early 1930s, or right through the 1930s, I would say. That was its heyday. And on into the 40s until he died. And nobody could make up their minds whether this man was the greatest master since Jesus Christ or whether he was an arrant rascal. He wrote a book called All and Everything, which is Beelzebub's tales to his son, and an incredibly funny book. But Gurdjieff had an apartment in Paris, and all the meetings were secret. You could only get there by invitation. And when you arrived, at this apartment, there would be some obscure little Russian woman sitting at a table at the entrance, checking you out as to whether you were really the person who had the invitation. And immediately an atmosphere of mystery had been spread around. And then you went through a passageway which was piled all along one side with trunks. As if, you had just arrived. And on top of these trunks there were various objects of art and stuff. And finally you were shown into a room where everybody was sitting around in dead silence, looking as if they'd swallowed canaries. And then after a while, somebody would open a manuscript and begin to read some of Mr. Gurdjieff's incomprehensible writing. Everybody would sit and listen and try to make out whether this was the real revelation. And as you sat there, you would become aware, in a funny way, of being watched. And you would look around and suddenly notice that through the crack of a door, there was a very impressive eye staring right at you. Mr. Gurdjieff was around the corner of the door, beating on his pupils, seeing who was reacting in the right way, who had do you really, you see, have the interior knowledge about this? And there's the eye of the master watching. Then when this got over, he would invite everybody to lunch. And then suddenly more rooms would be revealed in the background, and there were huge tables spread, absolutely jammed. Caviar and borscht and shashlik and piroshki and vodka. And little women in babushkas scurrying around serving all this. And suddenly Mr. Gurdjieff would order everybody to drink a toast. One knuckle of vodka. And everybody, even teetotalers, had to drink, or they couldn't be his guests. And he would toast the left-hand upper corner of the room. All sorts of fantastic toasts would be drunk. And nothing could put Mr. Gurdjieff under the table. Nothing. People would get dizzy and would get there. They would feel, well, the teacher is testing us because he wants to see how we are in our cups, in vino veritas. And then suddenly everything would be cleared and the meal would be over, and he would divide the group into two. One would stay home to wash up. One would go out for a ride. But everybody who went out for a ride must bring back a present for the people who stayed home to wash up. So this would happen, but it was on Sunday or something, or a holiday, and all the stores were closed. So they couldn't find any presents. And they were a little bit too lazy to anyway. And so he would humiliate them all by going back into his inner office and bringing out presents for all those people who stayed home. Because his inner office, which you would think a great master would have, would be a library. This man's office was a delicatessen. It consisted shelf upon shelf of cheeses, of pâté de foie gras, of caviar, of candies, and where he sat in his chair over his head, there hung on a thread a chocolate fish covered in silver paper, which slowly revolved with the breeze. Then he had an ashram at Fontainebleau, where everybody was given work assignments, and they dug for many hours, working in the garden. And suddenly, when they couldn't stand it any longer and the rigors of it all were too much, he would suddenly change everything and they would have a feast. Or he would teach them dances in which all the limbs moved at different rhythms. You know how hard it is to rub your stomach and pat your head at the same time, you know? And he would make it do all kinds of things like that. Well, the point is that he dug in with this, a cosmology, which was out Blavatsky in being as absurd as it could possibly be. And so here was this man who, from my judgment, was a great man and a very, very enlightened man, but he was playing the role of a charlatan. And by doing this, he was testing out these students, waiting for the person who would say to him, "Now really, Mr. Gurdjieff, come on. What's all this about?" See? But unfortunately, as is always the way, the teacher suffers from good students, like Uspensky, who swallowed it all hook, line, and sinker, and began to promulgate it as a system, when the whole point of the system was lost. So, when you get a man like that, he is challenging you. Now, some people got violent and they couldn't stand him, and they said he's an immoral bastard. He is a charlatan. He's a pervert. He's everything. He's a drunk. Everything's wrong. And they said, "Down with you." The other people said, "Oh, master, oh, dear master," you know, and all this kind of thing. It's sickening. And they didn't make out either. But the people who graduate were the people of the middle way, who didn't have to be aggressive on the one hand, didn't have to be impressed on the other. See? That's the middle way. That's getting the point. But you see, how are you going to do that without trying to be natural? See, you approach the teacher, am I really being natural with this guy? You see, and you're lost right there. Because he is in the advantageous position in the game because he has nothing to lose. You've defined him as the teacher. So he sits back and relaxes. He can do anything and not lose face. Like Suzuki, who can take forever to answer the question, or be fast asleep and be mistaken for being in deep samadhi. And because, after all, he doesn't have to prove anything. He's not concerned as to whether he is or isn't a good Zen student. He's just natural. But he's not natural in a forced way. That is to say, he's not going around trying to be natural, therefore being a phony. So then, in this whole evolution of what you might call competitive game as to which of you is the wisest, watch out. What is the test going to be in the end? Which of you is the wisest? Who can be banged about enough without screaming? Is that the test? That's often the way it's put. How much suffering? See? All right, we've settle for that, see? And then we can all sit on a pin and see how long we can do it. Or all sit like this and see how long we can take it without changing position. Then who's going to win? Crazy. Now then, somebody's going to come up and say, yeah, but that's all very well. But the point comes when you can suffer without screaming so much that nobody is quite sure whether you were dead or not already. For all if you whip a dead horse, nothing happens. And you put pins into a dead man and he won't scream. So maybe your yogi self-control and your discipline has reached such a point that it's made you effectively dead. You can't be moved. Yeah, that was that thing about that lecture on Zazen we had. That when there was a reaction to something that went pop, some people's systems went all over the place when there was a pop. With the adept in Zazen, they went like this, you know, the click test, and nothing happened. Well, you say, was he very, very calm and collected and he didn't really mind it? Or was it that he just got his feelings atrophied? Which is it? See? Well, this is a game. And we can play in all sorts of ways. But if you compete too hard, you see, to be the great self-disciplined one, to be always in possession of yourself, to be always immovable, you will eventually reach the point where you will lose the game because someone will outplay you by accusing you of being a dummy. Same, but after all, isn't it great to have emotions? Emotions, look what you're missing. You're a calm Buddha in nirvana and you have no emotions. That's a wretched kind of a world to get mixed up in. I like to feel very strongly, one way or the other. I'd be terribly happy and terribly miserable. One's the price of the other, pretty much. And so you can say to that stone Buddha sitting, you've got no guts. You won't let yourself get caught. You won't let yourself fall in love because you're afraid. And so you've said to it all, sour grapes. You shouldn't fall in love. You shouldn't become attached to the world. You're afraid of it. So it goes.
The only way to handle danger is to face it. If you start getting frightened of it, then you make it worse. Because you project onto it all kinds of bogies and threats which don't exist in it at all. Whenever you meet a ghost, don't run away. Because the ghost will capture the substance of your fear and materialize itself out of your own substance. And will kill you eventually, because it will take over all your own vitality. So then, whenever confronted with a ghost, walk straight into it, and it will disappear. We've got to survive. You must survive. That's the great thing we're all working on, and pounding it out day after day in anxiety, because this is a description of anxiety. Anxiety is the fear that one of a pair of opposites might cancel the other forever. And if by any chance, by any means, you find out that that is not so, you have an entirely new attitude to what human beings are doing, which may be very creative, but which also may be very dangerous. You see through the game. You are only just kidding that you're just poor little me. See, the function of a guru, that is to say a spiritual teacher in India, is to give you a funny look in the eye. Because you come to him and say, Mr. Guru, I have problems. I suffer and it's a mess and I can't control my mind and I'm miserable and depressed and so on. And he gives you a funny look. And you feel a bit nervous about the way he looks at you, because he's reading your thoughts. This man is a great magician. He can read everything that's in you. He knows right down into your unconscious, and you know all the dreadful things you've thought and all the awful desires you have, and you are rather embarrassed that this man looks right through you and sees them all. But that's not what he's looking at. He's giving you a funny look for quite another reason altogether, because he sees in you the Brahman, the Godhead, just claiming it's poor little me. That's why he gives you a funny look, and why he seems to see right through you, as if to say, Shiva, old boy, don't kid me. I know who you are, but you're coming on beautifully in this act, that you're somebody else altogether. And I congratulate you, you're doing a wonderful job playing this part, which you call the person, my person. So, it's all very well. Anybody can have access. Anybody, as a matter of fact, can become aware that he is one with the eternal ground of the universe. But since that's what you are anyway, I'm going to ask, so what? When a hero goes on an adventure, and he leaves his people, and is going to a strange land, he can go away and just hide himself round the corner in an obscure house, and then appear a year later and say, I've been on a heroic journey, and tell all sorts of tales. And they say, prove it. Because they expect him to bring back something which nobody has seen before. Then they believe you've been on a journey. So in the same way exactly, anybody who goes on a spiritual journey must bring something back. Because if you just say, oh man, it was a gas. Anyone can say that. Now this is why in the doctrines of Buddhism, there is a differentiation between two kinds of enlightened beings. They are both forms of Buddha, which is to say the word Buddha means somebody who has awakened, who has discovered the secret behind all this. In other words, all this thing we call life with its frantic concerns is a big act, which you, in your unconscious depth, are deliberately setting up. So you can do one of two things when you discover this. You can become what's called a pratyeka Buddha. That means a private Buddha, who doesn't tell anything. Or you can become a bodhisattva. Pratyeka Buddha goes off into his ecstasy and never is seen again. Bodhisattva is one who comes back and appears in the everyday world and plays the game of the everyday world by the rules of the everyday world. But he brings with him upaya. He brings with him some way of showing that he's been on the journey, that he's come back, and he's going to let you in on the secret too. If you will play it cool and also come back to join in the everyday life of everyday people. The first thing then is to discover what indeed you do love, if anything, and you will find there is something. And then go into the nature of that. Now it's said that selfish people love themselves, is something which you thought was other than yourself. Even if it be very ordinary things such as ice cream or booze, in the conventional sense, booze is not you, nor is ice cream. It turns into you in a manner of speaking when you consume it, but then you don't have it anymore. And so you look around for more in order to love it once again. But so long as you love it, you see, it's never you. When you love people, even however selfishly you love them, because of the pleasant sensations they give to you, still, it is somebody else that you love. And as you inquire into this, as you follow honestly your own selfishness, many interesting transformations begin to come about in you. One of the most interesting transformations of being directly and honestly selfish, in the same way that, for example, cats are, is that you stop deceiving people. If what you define as you is inseparable from everything which you define as not you, just as front is inseparable from back, then you realize that deep down between self and other there is some sort of conspiracy. If these things always occur in combination and look very different from each other and feel quite different, nevertheless the feeling of difference between them allows each one to exist. And so underneath the opposition or the polarity between self and other, or between any other pair of opposites you can think of, there is something in common, as there is, for example, between figure and background. You can't see a figure without a background. You can't have an organism without an environment. Equally, you can't have a background without a figure, or an environment without organisms in it, or without things in it. You can't have space which is unoccupied by any solid. You cannot have solids not occupying some space. This is absolutely elementary, and yet we don't realize it, because, for example, the average person thinks that space is nothing. It is just a sort of not there-ness in which there are things. And we are slightly afraid that not there-ness, that nothingness, that darkness, that the negative poles of all these oppositions will win. That they will eventually swallow up every kind of being and every kind of there-ness. But when you catch on to the game, you realize that that won't happen. Because what is called not existing is quite incapable of being there without the contrast of something called existing. It's like the crest and the trough of a wave. You can't have a wave that is all trough and no crest, just as you can't have a wave which is all crest and no trough. Such a thing has never been manifested in the physical universe. They go together. And that is the secret. There really is no other secret than that. That is the secret.
So long as you are trying to make progress, you will go up. But up always implies down. So while you are trying to get better and better and better, that means that when you get to the best, you can only go on to the worst. And so you go round and round and round, ever chasing the illusion that there is something outside yourself, outside your here and now, to be attained that will make things better. And the thing is to recover from that illusion. So a Buddha means somebody who has woken